Imagine a night when the temperature outside drops so low that the trees in the forest crackle with frost like rifle shots. Inside your only shelter, there is no thermostat, no electric blanket, not even sealed double-glazed windows to retain precious heat. You are in a wooden box in the middle of a vast wasteland, and the only thing separating you from certain death is a few inches of wood and a dying fire in the hearth. We tend to romanticize life in log cabins, imagining them as cozy nests with cheerfully crackling firewood. However, the reality of winter nights on the frontier was a harsh battle to maintain body temperature, where every crack in the wall could be fatal. It was not just a place to sleep, but a complex system of survival, honed by years of bitter experience and passed down from generation to generation. Watch the video to the end, and you'll learn how an ordinary potato could save a person from frostbite in their own bed. Are you ready to learn the truth about what really happened when the candle was blown out? We are used to thinking that a night away from civilization is a time of absolute silence and peace. But for the frontier settlers, this was not the case. With the onset of darkness, the cabin began to take on a life of its own, a frightening and noisy one. The logs that made up the walls reacted to the drop in temperature with sharp sounds resembling moans or blows. The cooling wood contracted, and this process was accompanied by a constant creaking that did not allow for a moment of relaxation. The wind on the Great Plains did not just blow, it literally rammed into the walls of the house, testing their strength with every gust. Without the familiar city noise, every sound outside seemed 10 times louder and closer. The crunch of snow under someone's footsteps or the howling of the blizzard created an atmosphere of constant tension. People lay in the dark, listening to every rustle, trying to distinguish the sound of a falling branch from the footsteps of an uninvited guest. Inside the hut, too, there was no absolute silence, as the fire in the hearth lived its own life. The coals could suddenly crackle, throwing out a shower of sparks, or a log could crash down with a bang, disturbing the inhabitants' fitful sleep. The breath of those sleeping in the cold air was heavy and audible, creating the rhythm of nightlife in the house. Even the furniture, made of rough wood, reacted to changes in humidity and temperature with its own sounds. In addition to the sounds, there was the problem of absolute, ink-like darkness, which modern man cannot even imagine. In a hut without windows or with tightly closed shutters, there was no source of light except for smoldering coals. If the fire went out, darkness fell, and it was impossible to see your own hand in front of your face. This created a feeling of complete disorientation in space, even in your own home. Moving around the hut in such conditions became a dangerous quest, where every step threatened injury. People memorized the location of each object by heart, relying solely on touch and muscle memory. Any item left out of place could cause serious injury at night. Therefore, strict order was not a whim, but a strict safety rule. The smells in a closed room at night became thick and palpable, mixing into a heavy cocktail. The smell of smoke, damp wool, old leather, and cooking food permeated everything around. Ventilation was minimal, as any airing meant a loss of precious heat. By morning, the air became stale, heavy, and damp from people's breath. The sense of time was completely erased in such darkness, and the night seemed endless. Without clocks, people relied only on their internal sensations and the state of the fire in the hearth. Waking up in the middle of the night, it was impossible to tell whether 2 hours had passed or dawn was approaching. This state of timelessness was as exhausting to the psyche as the physical cold. The fear of what was outside intensified in this thick darkness and isolation. The thin walls seemed like unreliable protection from the vast, cold, and hostile world. Every night was a small rehearsal for the end of the world, where a small group of people stood up to the elements. Only dawn brought relief, returning color and familiar outlines to the world. I wonder, could you spend even one night in such absolute darkness and sound isolation? Write in the comments what you would miss most from the modern world in such a hut. What if I told you that the walls of their houses were actually like sieves? The log cabins we see in movies often look like monolithic fortresses, but the reality of the first buildings was different. Freshly cut logs tended to dry out and warp over time, changing their shape and volume. Gaps inevitably formed between the logs, allowing the icy wind to blow freely in from the street. The process of sealing these gaps, called caulking, was an endless battle with nature and the physics of materials. Settlers used a mixture of clay, dirt, moss, and even manure to fill the space between the logs. This mixture dried out, cracked in the frost, and fell out in pieces, opening the way for the cold. Every fall, they had to go around the entire house again, restoring the protective layer. Inside the hut on a windy night, you could feel the draft on your feet, despite the burning hearth. People hung skins and old blankets along the walls to create an additional insulating layer. These improvised tapestries not only decorated the dwelling, but also created an air gap. The movement of these skins in the walls caused by the wind created the eerie impression that the house was breathing. The corners of the house were the most vulnerable places, as this was where the logs were least tightly joined. In severe frosts, frost could form directly on the interior walls in the corners of the room. This meant that the temperature in these areas dropped below zero, despite the heating. Bedrooms were placed as far away from the outer walls and corners as possible. Windows, if there were any, were covered with oiled paper or ox bladders, which let in light but did little to keep the heat in. Cold air penetrated through such windows almost unhindered, cooling the air in the room. At night, the window openings were closed with heavy wooden shutters or covered with thick blankets. But even these measures did not prevent a thick layer of ice from forming on the windowsills. The door was another critical element of defense against the cold that required special attention. It was often low to minimize the escape of warm air when opened. The gap under the door was plugged with special fabric rolls stuffed with sand or rags. This simple invention, called a draft snake, is still used in some homes today. The floor in most early huts was earthen, compacted to the hardness of concrete. The earth retained the cold, and walking barefoot on such a floor was a sure way to get sick. Straw, reed mats, or animal skins were laid on top of the earth to insulate the feet as much as possible. However, the cold from the earth penetrated through any layers, forcing people to stay closer to the fire. There was often no ceiling, and the roof was the only barrier above, creating a huge volume of air to heat. The heat rose, accumulating under the ridge of the roof, while it was cold below. This temperature difference created constant air circulation inside the room. The inhabitants of the hut lived in a constant draft created by their own heating system. In such conditions, the concept of room temperature was very relative and uneven. One's face could be burning from the heat of the hearth, while one's back was freezing from the cold coming from the wall. People constantly turned around, as if on a spit, trying to warm up evenly. Life in a hut required constant movement and a search for the golden mean between heat and ice. But even if the walls were securely caulked, there was another enemy of sleep, the very design of the bed. In the next chapter, you will learn why the expression "to sleep soundly" had a literal technical meaning. Want to know a secret that will change your perception of comfort once and for all? A bed on the frontier was not just a piece of furniture, but a complex engineering structure designed to save lives. The earliest beds were often built into the corner of a house, using the walls of the hut as support. This saved wood and space, but tied sleepers to the coldest areas of the house. The base for the mattress was not plywood or springs, but a weave of stiff ropes. The ropes were stretched across a wooden frame, creating a net that was supposed to support a person's weight. Over time, the ropes stretched and sagged, causing the sleeper to slide into the middle of the hammock. This is where the need to regularly tighten the bed with a special wooden wrench came from. The mattress itself, or tick, was a huge bag made of coarse fabric that had to be filled independently. Anything that could be collected was used as filling: straw, hay, corn husks, or dry moss. This filling had to be changed and fluffed up regularly, as it would clump together and turn into a hard pancake. In addition, insects loved to nest in such organic filling. Corn husks were a popular filling because they were affordable and relatively soft. However, they had one significant drawback. They rustled loudly with every movement. When turning from side to side, a person created a noise that seemed deafening in the silence of the night. Over time, people got used to this sound, like the sound of rain outside the window. Pillows were a luxury, and their filling also depended on luck in the hunting season. The best option was goose or duck feathers, which were carefully collected over the years. Those who did not have poultry stuffed their pillows with wool, rags, or straw. Sleeping on such a pillow was uncomfortable, and in the morning, marks from the rough fabric often remained on the face. The height of the bed above the floor was critical for maintaining a comfortable sleeping temperature. Beds were made as high as possible to raise the sleeper above the coldest air near the floor. Chests or supplies were often stored under the bed, creating an additional barrier to drafts. The higher you slept, the warmer you were, and this was a fact confirmed by practice. The blankets were heavy, often sewn from scraps of old clothing, wool, or coarse cloth. The weight of the blankets was so significant that it literally pressed a person to the mattress, restricting movement. But it was this weight that provided the necessary insulation and a feeling of security. Heavy bison or bear skins were often thrown on top for final warmth. The canopy over the bed was not a decorative element for beauty, but served a practical purpose. The thick fabric stretched over the sleeping area created a microclimate, trapping the warmth of breath. It also protected against debris that could fall from the ceiling or roof. In the morning, it was significantly warmer inside the canopy than in the rest of the room. People had to sleep in cramped conditions, often with several people in one bed to stay warm. This violated personal space, but it was the only way to keep from freezing alone. Bodies worked like living heaters, sharing warmth with each other under a mountain of blankets. Individualism gave way to the harsh necessity of survival. This complex sleeping system required daily maintenance and preparation before nightfall, but no amount of blankets could save them if the main source of life in the house went out. Ready to find out why a dying hearth was considered a harbinger of doom? Don't forget to like if you were surprised by the design of the beds. Are you ready for the shocking truth that fire could kill as easily as it could save? The hearth was the heart of the home, the only source of heat, and handling it required skills developed over generations. People knew that any mistake could deprive them of their nighttime warmth or turn into disaster. Before going to bed, you couldn't just leave the fire burning at full strength because the wood would burn too quickly. The head of the household had to perform a procedure called banking the fire to keep the heat until morning and prevent the family from waking up to the freezing cold. This practice was as important as closing the doors against the night wind. The coals were raked into a dense pile at the back of the hearth, creating a concentrated core of heat that could last for hours. This pile was formed carefully, trying to keep the hottest coals in the center. Then it was covered with a layer of soft ash which limited air access, but allowed the heat to smolder evenly and for a long time. This method was so effective that it was used in different countries and cultures until recent centuries. In the morning, it was enough to stir the ashes with an iron poker and throw in a little dry kindling to make the flames flare up brightly and vividly. Thus, the family began the day with warmth that seemed to have survived the night with them. If a person made a mistake in this process, the consequences could be tragic. And it was not just about the cold. Too much ash could smother the fire completely, leaving the house freezing by dawn. But it was even more dangerous to close the chimney damper too early in an attempt to keep the heat at any cost. Then carbon monoxide began to accumulate in the room, filling it with an invisible fog. This invisible killer put people to sleep so quietly that they did not have time to wake up. Therefore, a small gap was always left for draft, sacrificing warmth for the sake of saving lives. In order for the fire to behave predictably, it was necessary to choose the right wood, because each tree burns in its own way. Soft woods, such as pine, burned quickly, crackled and shot sparks, increasing the risk of fire. Denser woods kept the heat steady and long-lasting, making them ideal for nighttime heating. People studied the properties of wood for centuries, observing how it behaved in the hearth. That is why oak or maple, which provided steady, even heat, were saved for the night. A huge log, called a night log, was laid last as a reliable guarantee of warmth. This night log was often made of particularly strong wood that could smolder until almost dawn. It was brought in advance and kept inside the house so that it would be dry and not smoke. When evening came, the owner carefully placed it deep in the hearth next to the already smoldering coals. It became a kind of fire accumulator, giving off heat slowly and evenly. If the log was well chosen, the family could sleep through the night without waking up. But if it was damp or not dense enough, the night could be spent constantly stoking the fire. Sparks were always a danger to a wooden house, especially if the roof was thatched. There were no protective screens in front of the fireplace, as glass structures were a luxury. Therefore, the floor in front of the hearth was often scorched and covered with dark spots from accidental sparks. People got used to sleeping lightly, because any crackling could mean danger. If a coal jumped out of the fire, it could smolder unnoticed until it ignited a pillow or reed mattress. This constant threat made a good night's sleep uncertain. Even the location of the bed in the room was determined by the fire, because the heat was distributed unevenly. It was hot closer to the hearth, and sometimes it was even necessary to cover up more lightly so as not to overheat. Near the far wall, water left in a jug overnight could freeze. People had to change places or turn around to avoid numbness from the cold or the intense heat. This change of position became a habit. Life with fire was like a slow dance in which each participant sought their place. If the fire went out in the middle of the night, it was a real disaster. It was extremely difficult to rekindle the hearth in the dark, especially when your hands were frozen numb. People used flint and steel, but the spark often went out before it had time to catch fire. There were no matches, and later equivalents were expensive and stored as valuables. Therefore, it was often necessary to go to neighbors for burning coals. Such a visit could be the only chance to restore warmth before dawn. But even going out for coals had its dangers, especially if severe frost or bad weather made the night almost impossible to see. People thought in advance about who they could turn to if the fire went out unexpectedly. Fire was a living thing that needed constant attention, feeding, and respect. It was a companion, friend, and enemy, capable of warming and destroying. Taking care of it was a daily duty on which the health and peace of mind of the whole family depended. People treated fire almost like a household spirit that required rituals and caution. Carelessness could lead to disaster at any moment. In the next chapter, you will learn what tricks people use to warm not only the air, but also their beds. Keeping the body warm was a complex task that could not be solved by relying on blankets alone. Sleeping completely naked in such cold weather was unthinkable and even dangerous. People went to bed in their underwear, which often consisted of a long woolen or flannel shirt. Sometimes, in particularly severe frosts, they did not even take off their daytime clothes, simply loosening their belts. The most important element of nightwear was a nightcap, worn by both men and women. A significant amount of heat is lost through the head, and the cap helped to conserve precious energy. It also protected the ears from frostbite if the temperature in the house dropped below zero at night. It was not a funny accessory from fairy tales, but a necessary element of survival. Before going to bed, it was customary to warm the bed using various devices. A metal hot water bottle on a long handle, filled with hot coals from the fireplace, was the height of comfort. It was passed between the sheets to drive out dampness and cold before going to bed. Those who did not have such luxury used simpler methods. Ordinary river stones or bricks were heated by the fire and then wrapped in thick cloth. This stone battery was placed at the feet and could retain heat for several hours. It was important not to overheat the stone so as not to burn the fabric or the feet. In the morning, the cooled stone was still warmer than the surrounding air. They also used bags of heated sand or grain, which worked on the same principle. They were softer than stones and molded better to the shape of the body, warming the lower back or chest. The smell of heated grain created an additional feeling of comfort in a cold bed. These were simple but effective methods of local heating. The natural warmth of the human body was the most reliable source of heat under the blanket. People slept huddled close together, often in a jack position, to make the most of the bed space. Back to back was the most common position, allowing them to keep each other warm. Loneliness on such a night was a physically cold ordeal. Heavy wool socks were a must-have for all family members when sleeping. Feet were the first to get cold, and if they were cold, it was impossible to warm up completely. Often, two pairs were worn, thin ones on the bottom and thick, knitted ones on top. In the morning, these same socks remained on the feet, with boots simply added on top. Hands were hidden under the armpits or between the thighs so that the fingers would not go numb during sleep. Putting a hand out from under the blanket to adjust the pillow was a real feat of willpower. The air in the room was so cold that the nose, the only exposed part of the body, became icy. People often covered themselves with their heads, creating a breathing cave under the blanket. Getting up in the morning was the most difficult moment, requiring instant mobilization of the body. It was physically painful to climb out of the warm cocoon into the icy air of the room. Clothes were placed under the blanket or hung by the fire in the evening so that they would be warm in the morning. Putting on frozen pants was a shock that instantly dispelled the remnants of sleep. All these methods were aimed at minimizing the loss of heat generated by the body. It was a passive defense against an aggressive environment that did not forgive mistakes. But the cold attacked not only through the walls and windows, but also from below. In the next chapter, you will learn how the floor became the main enemy of comfort. What if I show you a place where winter lived inside the house itself? The floor of the hut was the coldest surface, as cold air, being heavier than warm air, sank down. Even if it was hot near the ceiling, the temperature at floor level could be close to that outside. This created an ice lake effect, which the inhabitants had to walk on. Earthen floors, common in early huts, never warmed up and drew moisture from the soil. They were hard, uneven, and constantly dusty, despite attempts to moisten them. Covering the floor with straw or reeds helped little, as the organic material quickly rotted and became saturated with moisture. In addition, small items were lost in the straw and were impossible to find. Wooden floors made of split logs, called planks, were better, but had their own problems. The logs did not fit tightly together, and an icy wind blew through the cracks from under the floor. The subfloor was often exposed to the wind, and in winter, drafts blew through it. It was impossible to walk on such a floor without shoes even in summer, and in winter it was simply dangerous. To combat the cold coming from below, people used homespun rugs and animal skins. Carpets woven from old rags created at least some insulation between the feet and the icy wood. Skins were warmer, but they wore out quickly and collected dirt and debris. Cleaning such coverings was a laborious task that required beating them in the cold. They tried to plug the cracks in the floor in the same way as in the walls, but the constant vibration from walking destroyed the putty. Rags stuffed into the cracks were a temporary solution that had to be constantly renewed. Sometimes in winter, a layer of sawdust was spread on the floor for additional insulation. Although this added to the dirt, in corners where air circulation was poor, the floor could become covered with frost. The inhabitants' feet suffered most from the cold, which led to rheumatism and colds. People wore shoes inside the house all the time, taking them off only before going to bed. Fur-lined moccasins or felt boots were the indoor footwear of the time. Sitting with your legs tucked under you was the most natural position on a chair or bench. The cold floor also affected the storage of food, which was often placed directly on the boards or the ground. Potatoes or milk could freeze on the floor, even if there was a fire burning in the stove. Supplies had to be lifted onto shelves or benches to protect them from the cold. This dictated the organization of space and daily life inside the hut. Washing floors in winter was a rare event, as the water froze instantly, turning the house into a skating rink. They used dry cleaning with a broom or sprinkled the floor with wet sand, which was then swept away along with the dirt. Hygiene took a back seat to the need to stay dry and warm. A damp floor was much more dangerous than a dirty one. The whole family's life was centered on elevated areas: beds, benches, tables. The floor was hostile territory that had to be crossed quickly and with shoes on. Children and adults instinctively sought higher ground. But if it was an icy hell below, the situation above was different. but no less difficult. Ready to learn how people use the attic to survive? The space under the roof, known as the loft or attic, played a key role in the thermal balance of the hut. Warm air rising from the hearth accumulated there, making the loft the warmest place in the house. This physical phenomenon was used to the maximum by arranging sleeping places there. The staircase to the top was often just a few pegs driven into the wall or a rough ladder. However, despite the rising heat, the loft had its serious drawbacks in terms of comfort. The roof was thin, often covered only with shingles or bark, and separated the sleepers from the sky by just a couple of centimeters. During heavy snowfalls, snow could blow into the cracks in the roof, forming drifts directly on the sleeping blankets. Waking up under a layer of snow was commonplace for those who slept upstairs. The sounds of nature were even more distinct here. The wind howled right above your ears and the rain drummed on your head. The creaking of the rafters under the weight of snow or wind created a feeling of insecurity. But warmth was more important than silence, and a place in the attic was considered a privilege in winter. In summer, however, it was unbearably hot and stuffy there because of the sun-heated roof. The loft floor was often just a platform of poles through which the room below could be seen. This allowed heat to pass upstairs unhindered, but deprived it of any privacy. Light and sounds from below penetrated upstairs, so that the family's life was visible to everyone. Dust and debris from the attic also fell down, right onto the table or the heads of those below. The attic was often used to store dried herbs, vegetables, and other supplies that needed to be kept warm and dry. The smell of dried mint, tobacco, or onions mixed with the smell of smoke, creating a distinctive aroma. These bundles, hung under the rafters, created bizarre shadows in the light of the hearth. The loft was simultaneously a bedroom, a storeroom, and a drying room. The ceiling height in the loft was minimal, and it was only possible to stand up straight in the center, under the ridge. It was necessary to move around on all fours or bent over, which was uncomfortable. Hitting your head on the rafters was a frequent occurrence, but one quickly got used to it. It was not a space for living, but exclusively for lying down. Smoke from the hearth rising upward also accumulated under the roof if the draft was poor. Those sleeping in the loft breathed more smoky air, which affected their lungs and eyes. In the morning, people often woke up with a cough and watery eyes. It was the price they had to pay for warmth with their health. In some huts, the loft did not have a floor over the entire area, but was simply a shelf. Sleeping on such a shelf was risky, as it was possible to fall down while asleep. Special sides or railings were made from poles to prevent falls. Safety was sacrificed for the sake of preserving heat. Insulating the roof from the inside with skins or fabric helped to retain heat and protect against drafts. This turned the loft into a kind of den, dark and cramped, but relatively warm. It was here that the harshest nights could be endured, when the water froze in the bucket below. The loft was a vivid example of using every cubic centimeter of heat in the struggle for life. It was a realm of warmth, smoke, and cramped quarters. But it was necessary not only to preserve the heat, but also to create it around oneself with the help of the right materials. In the next chapter, we will talk about the heavy artillery of home comfort, quilted blankets. A quilt was not just a bedding accessory, but a true symbol of survival and thriftiness. Fabric was an expensive and scarce commodity on the frontier, so not a single scrap was thrown away. Old shirts, dresses, flour sacks, everything was put to use, turning into new items. Quilts were sewn from hundreds of small pieces, creating colorful and thick fabrics. The secret to a quilt's warmth lay in its multiple layers and the air pocket inside. Filling was placed between two layers of fabric, carded wool, cotton, or even old worn-out blankets. Quilting, i.e., stitching all the layers together, held the filling in place. The denser the stitches, the longer the quilt lasted and the warmer it was. Such a blanket could weigh several kilograms, creating noticeable pressure on the body. This weight was not perceived as an inconvenience, but as a guarantee of protection from the cold. It was difficult to turn over under such a heavy weight, but there were no drafts under the blanket. People literally barricaded themselves in bed with these textile slabs. The number of blankets on one bed could reach 5 or 6 on the coldest nights. In the morning, when climbing out from under such a mountain, a person felt physical relief from the shed load. The layered construction allowed the temperature to be regulated by adding or removing layers as needed. The best and most beautiful blankets were placed on top, and the old and coarse ones were placed at the bottom. Wool was the best material for blankets because it kept you warm even when wet. Sheep's wool had unique thermoregulatory properties, preventing people from overheating or freezing. However, wool blankets were prickly and required protection in the form of a sheet. They also attracted moths, which were a constant concern for housewives. In addition to fabric blankets, tanned wild animal skins were widely used. Bison skin, or buffalo robe, was incredibly warm, heavy, and windproof. One such skin was often enough to replace several ordinary blankets. However, the skins had a specific smell and over time began to shed, leaving hair everywhere. Caring for blankets was hard work, as it was impossible to wash them in winter. They were regularly aired out in the cold to kill parasites and remove odors. Snow cleaning, when the blanket was rolled in clean snow and beaten, was an effective way to freshen it up. In the summer, a large wash was organized, which took several days. Blankets were valuable possessions that were passed down through generations and included in dowries. The loss of blankets in a fire or flood was a disaster comparable to the loss of livestock. Each blanket stored the history of the family in its patches. Here is a piece of my father's shirt, and here is a piece of a festive dress. It was a chronicle of life, sewn with coarse threads. Women would gather together for quilting bees, gatherings where they would sew quilts collectively. It was not only entertainment, but also a way to quickly provide the family with the necessary warmth. Working together allowed them to complete the difficult task of quilting in 1 or 2 days. The result was something that could last for decades. These heavy, colorful quilts, sewn with love and patience, were the last line of defense on a frosty night. They kept the bodies warm when the fire in the hearth died down and the house cooled. But the night inevitably ended, and the most difficult moment of the day arrived: waking up. Waking up in a log cabin in winter had nothing to do with cozy stretching in a warm bed. Morning came before dawn, when the world was completely silent, interrupted only by the crackling of frozen logs and the chattering of one's own teeth. The temperature in the house dropped almost to street levels overnight, especially if the fire in the hearth went out. White steam rose from their mouths and their eyelashes could stick together with frost, as if they had woken up under the open sky. Sometimes the blankets were covered with a thin layer of frost, and their breath seemed to ring in the icy air. The first task was to get out of the warm cocoon of the bed, which required an almost heroic effort of will. As soon as the furs or coarse woolen blankets were thrown aside, the cold penetrated to the bones. One would jump onto the floorboards, which were so icy that it felt like stepping on ice. He hurried to put on the clothes he had left out the night before, but the fabric was stiff, as if dried in the wind. He had to put them on quickly and sharply to warm his body through movement. Even his shoes were sometimes frozen solid, and he had to warm them with his hands to loosen the hardened edges. The main barometer of the night's cold was a bucket of water in the corner of the room. In the morning, there was almost always a thick crust of ice in it, which had to be broken with a knife or an axe. The thickness of the ice determined the conversations for the whole day.
We can still hold
The night
on.
was cruel, or we can still hold on. Washing with such water became a real test. The icy splashes burned the skin, instantly awakening better than any invigorating drink, which the peasants simply did not have. Then began the eternal struggle for fire, the most important ritual of the morning. It was necessary to carefully rake through the ashes, looking for tiny live coals that still retained the heat of the night. If they were found, a person would lean over the hearth and blow until a faint red breath of fire appeared. The small kindling crackled and slowly caught fire. If the coals were completely frozen, everything had to be started over again, striking a spark with flint with trembling fingers. The room filled with the familiar morning smoke, harsh and acrid, but so familiar because it meant that the house was coming back to life. The windows, hardened by the frost, were covered with thick ice patterns. Entire winter landscapes in miniature. They let in almost no light, and the hut was filled with a thick, gray twilight. To see what was happening outside, you had to scrape the ice with your fingernail or warm the glass with your breath. The door also often froze so tightly to the frame that you had to break it down with your shoulder, leaving painful marks of cold on your skin. Breakfast began only when the fire rose steadily, giving off its first rays of heat. Frozen food required special handling. Butter became as hard as river stone, lard had to be chopped with a hatchet, and bread had to be cut with a knife, as if it were a log. Metal utensils burned the lips with cold, so they were preheated by the fire. Warm food was not just a pleasure, it was fuel without which it would be impossible to survive even the morning. But household chores did not wait for the hut to warm up completely. It was necessary to go and feed the livestock, breaking the ice locks on the barn doors, chop wood that rang with the cold, and bring a bucket of fresh water from the ice hole. The contrast between the frosty house and the even colder street was sharp, almost painful, but without it, it was impossible to start the day. The women stayed by the hearth, drying clothes, heating water, bringing life back to the house, gradually driving out the night cold. The moisture that had accumulated overnight from breathing, snow on clothes, and cooking settled on the frozen walls. As the house began to warm up, it turned into drops that slowly trickled down. Morning became a time of internal thaw. Things on hooks were damp to the touch, and the wooden walls darkened from the dampness. Fighting moisture was as important as fighting frost, because damp cold was much more insidious than dry cold. Every morning was a small but significant victory over the merciless elements. The family inspected their home. Had the tubs burst? Had the supplies cracked from the cold? Had anyone fallen ill after a harsh night? They checked the roof, the walls, the condition of the hearth. Every morning was an audit of survival itself. The routine of these actions was honed to perfection and performed in almost complete silence. Words were saved as carefully as warmth. But behind this silence lay a profound philosophy of winter existence. Every morning was a reminder of the fragility of human life in the face of nature and the power of human endurance that allowed us to greet the dawn again and again. Survival on the frontier was not only a physical ordeal, but also a psychological battle with isolation and fear. The hut was the only island of safety in a vast ocean of cold and danger. The awareness that deadly cold lay beyond the thin walls brought the family together. The hearth became a sacred center around which all life revolved. The cramped conditions, which today would seem unbearable to us, were then perceived as a blessing. The proximity of other people provided a sense of security and physical warmth. Conflicts were nipped in the bud, as there was nowhere to go, and a quarrel could destroy the fragile microclimate. The ability to get along in a confined space was an important survival skill. The routine and predictability of daily life helped people stay sane in uncertain times. A clear daily schedule and repetitive household chores created the illusion of control over the situation. Chopping wood, cooking, and mending clothes filled the day with meaning. Idleness was a dangerous enemy, opening the door to despondency and fear. Evenings by the fire were a time for socializing and passing on cultural codes. Storytelling, reading aloud, if there was a book, singing, or simply sitting silently together strengthened bonds. In these moments, the cold and darkness receded into the background. The light of the fire outlined the boundaries of a safe world, beyond which chaos began. Hope for spring was the fuel that kept people's spirits up during the darkest months. Each day that passed brought them closer to warmth, sunshine, and new life. The calendar, often just notches on a log, was an important tool for keeping track of time. People lived according to the cycles of nature, accepting winter as an inevitable but temporary trial. Isolation taught people self-sufficiency and belief in their own strength. There was no help to be expected, and responsibility for life lay solely with the inhabitants of the hut. This shaped a special character, resilient, taciturn, and incredibly enduring. They knew the value of warmth and the price of mistakes, and this knowledge made them stronger. Fear of nature transformed into respect for its power and laws. People did not try to conquer nature. They learned to coexist with it, adapting to its rhythms. The hut was not a fortress opposing the world, but a refuge built into it. Harmony was achieved through understanding one's capabilities and limitations. Even in the harshest conditions, people found a place for beauty and comfort. An embroidered napkin, a carved spoon, a neatly stacked woodpile. Small things that made life human. The desire to decorate everyday life was a form of resistance to savagery and entropy. It was a statement. We are not just surviving here, we are living here. The memory of those cold nights stayed with people for the rest of their lives, even when they moved to warm houses. The habit of conserving heat, not throwing away food, and appreciating sturdy walls was passed on to future generations. It was an experience engraved in the subconscious, shaping the mentality of an entire nation. The story of winter nights in huts is a story of how the human spirit, armed only with wit and an axe, was able to settle in one of the harshest regions. It reminds us how little a person really needs to live and how much we have today. We have come a long way from the icy wind howling in the crevices to the warm hearth that brings the family together. Now you know that the romance of a log cabin hides behind it daily hard work and a constant struggle with the elements. Every item in the house, from the quilted blanket to the nightcap, was a tool in this battle for degrees. It was a life lived at the limit of possibility, where comfort was measured not by the softness of the pillows, but by the absence of frost on the walls. In the next episodes, we can delve deeper into the topic of everyday life and examine what people ate in conditions of winter isolation, or discuss the weapons that help them defend their homes. Write in the comments which topic you find more interesting: survival cooking or frontier arsenal? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories about conquering the Wild West.
Hard winter ahead.
We will struggle to make it through.